This feels a little weird. I haven't been in front of the camera in a while. So I want to talk about VSCO X. I've been using it now for the past couple months, and I've been shooting some mobile photography for the past year and a half or so. So I thought I'd talk about my experience with the app, whether or not it's worth it, and how I like to edit some photos on my phone. Alright, so VSCO X is just the premium version of VSCO. I'm sure you guys have heard of VSCO. It's the free mobile photo editing app. It's 20 bucks a year. Took me a minute to pull the trigger on that, but in the grand scheme of things, 20 bucks isn't that huge of an expense for a full year, and you get some pretty cool stuff out of it. So you get access to their entire preset library, and that includes the Film X presets, which are like the replicas of classic film stocks. So you get stuff like Kodak Portra and stuff like that. Definitely pretty cool. I love Kodak Portra. I think the colors and the way it looks is super dope, and they do a pretty decent job of replicating it. You also get the ability to import and edit video, which I use sometimes, but I don't get a whole lot of usage out of that. And then you unlock a few other tools such as the borders and HSL sliders. I don't use borders as much. I have another app for stuff like that. But the HSL sliders was honestly the biggest reason that I bought it. It just unlocks way more capabilities when it comes to how you want your photo to look and the style of it, and definitely made it worth the 20 bucks. So I want to jump into the app really quick. We can take a look at how I like to edit with it and take a look at some of my favorite presets, and I'll show you a few other apps that I like to use specifically for Instagram stories. I've already got my photo preloaded into the studio, which is just where you have all of your photos loaded in. I'm gonna go ahead and edit this cool shot of a mug. If you guys follow me on Instagram, you've probably seen it. Shot this with my phone. Definitely some Tumblr hipster porn, but I'm way into that stuff. So, right off the bat, we're just gonna throw a preset on here. This is AV4. This is one of my favorite presets, and right off the bat, it already looks super dope. But one of the things I always do is I drop the strength of the preset down, just because I don't want to rely on the preset too much. And you can come in here and play with the character of it. I don't like the look of this like faded shadow thing, so I usually leave that a little higher. And then the warmth, I tend to keep my photos somewhat neutral, sometimes on the warm side. I'm gonna go down to the sliders down here. So with the exposure, I always tend to drop my exposure a little bit just because I like my photos a little dark. So we're going to tone that down just a little bit, but we're probably going to end up coming back to it later on. The contrast, a lot of the film photography that I get really inspired by has a lot lower contrast, so I'll probably drop that a bit. Once again, I'll probably end up coming back to that as well. For cropping, typically I kind of just settle and go for the 4x5. Kind of a cop-out because it just fits Instagram perfectly. Okay, so that's looking fairly even. Again, I might come back to that as well. I tend to leave sharpening and clarity alone. For some landscape stuff, I'll bump the clarity up, but like if you go too much, it just looks outrageous, so typically I'll leave it alone. Saturation, I always drop it just a touch. Some people don't notice it, but I do. Highlights and shadows. This photo's pretty well balanced in the highlights and shadows, so I'm probably gonna leave it alone. But I usually play with the shadows a little bit to bring those up because I tend to underexpose my photos. White balance. This is a pretty good photo as is, but I do like to warm my photos up, like I said, just a little bit. That looks pretty good to me. Occasionally I'll add in a green tint, but usually I stray away from that. Skin tone, really only going to use if we have skin in there, but we do. And it's kind of hard to notice, so I usually go on the extremes for that. You can only barely tell that it's there. So we'll go ahead and just leave that as is. Vignette, this kind of helps bring the focus into a photo, but with all the leaves being pretty similar around the subject, I'll leave it alone. But if you do have like a portrait or something, I'd suggest using that to kind of focus in someone's attention onto the person. Grain, be careful with grain. It's definitely overused by some people, and it it does look fairly gimmicky. But I do think it looks pretty cool in some instances. Like there, that's too much. But I definitely like to add a little bit of grain here and then. And given that this is such a hipstery photo, I'll go ahead and throw that in. Fade, usually stay away from that. I used to love the way that looked in my early days of photography, but now I really don't like it, so I typically leave it. Split tone, whenever I do use it in the shadows, I usually slap an orange in there and drop it really low. I think it adds kind of a cool vintage feel to it. And highlights, typically I leave it alone, but if I do end up using it, I'll use blue and drop it way down. But I like it without it, so I'm gonna leave that as is. Make sure the shadows stay there. Okay, borders, this just allows you to like slap the photo into a border. I have apps for that, so I'm not gonna use that here. But then HSL sliders, like I said, this was the biggest reason for me buying it. So in this photo, and this is one of the reasons I chose this photo, we're gonna go ahead and play with the green. And this is a technique that a lot of people use on Instagram, I've noticed. It's definitely a very hipster look. It gives it a more moody, toned down look. What I'm gonna do here is bring the hue of the green to a little bit more of a bluish, just a little bit. And then we're gonna drop the saturation way low so that it's almost like a gray green. And you can still tell that it's green because it's very powerful, that green, but it adds this super like vintage moody feel to it. And once I drop the saturation, I will kind of play around with the hue a little bit to see if there's a better color that I like. Bring that back up just a touch. I like the way that looks. So then, like I said, I'm gonna come back down here. We're gonna drop the saturate or the exposure just a little bit. We can bump the contrast back up. I don't typically use higher contrast unless it's a non-portrait photo. I think lower contrast just works better. But in this case, I think it looks fairly good. Jump back into the crop. Just to straighten it up a little bit. And boom, I'm liking the way that looks. You can double tap on the photo and it'll bring it up with the preset below and the date. And if you use VSCO, you can post it to social, but I don't really use it as much, so I'll just export it. And I always do the actual size. Okay, so now that I have the photo edited, I'll usually have like 3 to 4 more photos just from an outing or something. And I like to create little stories for Instagram stories. One of the apps that I use to kind of amplify it is Unfold. It's just an Instagram stories design app, basically. They just have different layouts that you can stick your photos into and you can add text to. It's a free app, and I think the first set of layouts is free, and then the rest of them are anywhere from like 99 cents to $3. So really not that much, and it takes your stories to another level. One other app I use is Lens Distortions. This gives you the ability to like add in lens flares or bokeh. I don't really use it too much, but in some photos where I have like the sun in frame, I'll throw a lens flare in there and it takes it to the next level. But in some photos where I have like the sun directly in the frame, I'll throw a lens flare and it just kind of adds to the photo. It's really subtle, but for example, like in this photo, you can see that adding that lens flare just made it that much more cooler. I hope this was helpful in some way. I definitely appreciate being able to take an inside look at premium apps before I buy them. So if any of you guys are on the fence about buying it, maybe this swung you in one direction or the other, I definitely think it's worth it. 20 bucks for a full year really isn't too bad, and you get access to a lot of stuff. So I think that's where I'm gonna wrap up the video. I've been away for a while. For any of the loyal followers, I'm sure you've noticed there's been a lot of stuff going on this summer. Good things and bad things. I'll make videos on those some other time. So yeah, thanks for watching, guys. I will see you soon.